Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm just going to... Right, cool. So I'm going to talk about patient and carer experience of living with Lewy body dementia. This is very much a change of pace from this morning. So this is not about what's happening in the brain or in the genes. This is about what's happening in people's lives. And what we already know about living with Lewy body dementia is there are studies that show that patients with Lewy body dementia have lower quality of life than people with other types of dementia, for example, Alzheimer's. And that for carers of people with Lewy body dementia, there's more stress as well. But in order to develop an intervention that will help both patients and their families, we really need to understand what is it about Lewy body dementia specifically that is making life difficult for people. So, as part of the Diamond Lewy study, which has been mentioned a couple of times already today, it's a big programme funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and the overall aim of the programme is to improve the diagnosis and management of Lewy body dementia. And within that, I'm doing various qualitative studies. And one of the first bits of work we did was I wanted to look at and understand which aspects of living with Lewy body dementia were most difficult for patients and carers. So what specifically was it about it that caused them difficulty? And I didn't do it in a lab. I went out and talked to people, and I was very grateful for all the people who helped me find people to talk to, because it was quite hard work. And then in terms of analysis, what we do is we record the interviews, we get them transcribed or typed up, and then we look for themes. So in this sort of data analysis, I'm not saying this is everybody's experience, all people with Lewy body dementia think like this, all carers experience this. It's more that from all the interviews we did, these were the themes that seemed to be important and that stood out. And I was interested earlier in a question about the gender breakdown of Lewy body dementia, because in my sample it was very biased towards men in terms of patients, and I think that's just an artifact of who I was able to get. But I interviewed 18 men, 6 women patients. Some of them were joint interviews with their family members, and there were 34 family members. And again, they were predominantly female, so 22 wives, but only 2 husbands. And we included a small number of bereaved carers, and that was really useful because that enabled us to look at the experience of living with Lewy body dementia the whole way through. So in terms of our key themes, and I had to decide how I was going to spend my time today, so I've kind of focused in and then focused in again. But I just wanted to go through the whole set first. I think there was a big theme around making sense of Lewy body dementia. Because people aren't necessarily aware of it, they often haven't heard of it before their diagnosis, actually trying to understand what it is they're dealing with is really very difficult. And particularly, I don't think people understand the whole range of symptoms that might be involved and might be implicated. And that really affects the support they get, because people might not, we've got lots of examples of people saying, oh yeah, I've often got hurt in bed at night because he thrashes around in his sleep. It never occurred to me to tell anybody about that. So there's lots of hidden symptoms that just won't come up if doctors don't ask about them. Negotiating ongoing support is another area that people talked about quite a lot. So where did you get support from? What services were out there? What needs did you have? Information needs was another really interesting topic. And I think what I found particularly interesting about this, and it's obvious, is that people's information needs are very variable. So even in a couple, you may have a patient who wants to know not very much and a carer who wants to know everything. It could be the other way round. And one of the interesting things is, because I've also been sitting in on a lot of consultations, is that consultations are very rarely set up in a way that meets those different needs. Often people are just seen together. And that doesn't give any scope for dealing with the person who wants to know a lot and the person who would really rather not know anything. And the one I'm going to talk about in more detail is this red one about how do people adapt to the fact they're living with changing physical and cognitive abilities. So their life's shifting under them, how do they adapt to deal with that? And the other aspect was more about coping with the psychological impacts of Lewy body dementia. So just thinking about our changing physical and cognitive abilities, again, I've subdivided this a bit more. And obviously, your changing physical abilities had a big impact on the ability to do activities of daily living. For people who are still in work, it impacted on their ability to do their job, and also existing roles. So we have a lot of people who are grandparents and, doing things like being able to pick up the children from school and drive them home. There were issues around that for some people. Physical activities and exercise, and we had a couple of people who'd just stopped being able to swim and had actually literally got in a pool to go swimming and couldn't swim. So there were some interesting changes around physical abilities and exercise that then impacted on people's general health. But what I'm going to talk more about is social activities and engagement, because that seemed an appropriate theme for this conference today. And there were also, obviously, the tensions between wanting to be independent, having to accept help, and that is a real minefield for people to negotiate. So in terms of social activities and engagement, there were lots of different things going on, and some of that was to do with withdrawing from social activities, and there were a whole host of reasons for that. People that we talked to found it really difficult to manage group situations. So anything with background noise or simultaneous conversations going on, trying to filter out and attend to one conversation rather than another, people found very difficult and stressful. There were issues around anxiety and shame relating to some of the physical symptoms, particularly around eating. So things like going out for a meal, people sometimes felt they didn't want to do that anymore. There was a mismatch between needs and classes and activities, and I'll give you some examples of that. And one of the things I was interested in was this theme of isolation within the family. So you can accept that your social life might reduce a bit, but there was a real issue for some of these people about being isolated within their own families. And that could be confounded by withdrawal of friends and family. And of course, the other big issue that you'll all know about is the impact this has for the people living with the person with Lewy body dementia. So this was just a picture of a kind of activity we might all take for granted. Having some friends around, having a meal that you think is a straightforward activity that you just carry on doing. And what was difficult about it was things, I'll show you some quotes. I think there's a thing about keeping up with the shifting conversation. I think I'll let you read them yourself rather than read them out loud. And this theme of the cognitive difficulties being embarrassing. So, you'd see people in the street even, and they'd say hello and be really friendly, and people would report feeling just really embarrassed and, uncomfortable. And actually, it probably wasn't uncomfortable to the person. It probably wouldn't have mattered to the other person. But for the person with Lewy body dementia, I think it was very difficult. So, lots of things about withdrawing from social activities. But what we found for nearly all of these things, we talked to a lot of people who'd actually developed loads of strategies. So they had these difficulties, but lots of people found ways of dealing with them. And this was a guy with Parkinson's disease dementia who just talked about scaling your life down to do what you could do. So they didn't have people around for dinner because that was too hard and it was the wrong time of day if it was the evening now. But they have them for lunch or they go out for tea or coffee. So it's kind of just developing manageable activities. We talked to a lovely couple who had got this perfect local pub. And obviously every local environment needs one. It was a tiny pub, I think it was about 8 people in it every night. There was no music. And they described, that you'd go down there and so would be talking to his dad, and there'd be the gentle thud of the darts in the background. And for this person with Lewy body dementia, it was the perfect environment because actually it was small, it was familiar, it was close, and it enabled them to keep that sense of independence and being a person. That was, they went down the pub and they could keep that up. Hobbies and interests were really interesting. And I mean, these quotes are both from the same person, but I thought they both illustrated different points. This was a person with dementia who had been really keen on painting and had often done courses, and she was just describing the struggle that they were having in finding a suitable painting course that he could go to. So there were things like just basic accessibility. Not being able to get into the building. But even when he had found a different course in another building, it was the pacing of the activity that he really couldn't keep up with. So it wasn't geared up for his level of speed and ability anymore. And then she explained about how they'd been to these guided walks. And again, there was a pacing issue that, they were being left behind, stretched out at the back. And she hints at the end here, she thought it would be ideal to meet different people and supporting me so that I'm not watching him all the time. So that again was another example of the carer's need for support as well and social activity. But again, people had strategies. I mean, obviously that couple were working very hard to find the right activity. They just hadn't succeeded yet. A couple of people talked about how they did still go to the theatre. And they'd managed this by things like going to matinees instead of to evening performances, changing the types of show they went to see. And this chap was explaining about how his wife got very disturbed. So they tended to go on Saturday matinees to the ballet. And other people talked about the ballet being really nice and the music. And so he's saying you have to adjust to think like that. And then we talked quite a lot to people about support groups. And this was partly because we ended up recruiting some of the sample through support groups, so obviously they had things to say about them. And what was interesting, though, was that opinions were almost polarised about support groups. There were people who really enjoyed support groups and got a lot out of them and, had liked the opportunity to meet people and found that continuity in meeting people regularly very good. But then for other people, the second person, when he says, I haven't got too immersed in it because I feel like I'm being literally dragged down. So this sense for some people that you were looking at your future was very difficult. And so that wasn't really an option that was open to them. And then the other thing I thought was really interesting was this isolation within the family. And managing family gatherings did emerge as being something that was often quite challenging. And I particularly wanted to mention it with Christmas coming up. When we're all supposed to have a lovely time with all the family and a great melee of horror. But loads of people talked to us about how they found small children really difficult. And it was partly to do with the speed, it was partly to do with the noise, but it was also just to do with the sheer number of people sometimes that was in the house. And so you'd be there, physically there, but not necessarily joining in. And a carer talked about her husband, and she said, oh yeah, Grandad just sits in the corner and we just work around him. But there did seem to be one of the things that people did do, some people had done, was kind of find activities where actually, if you actually could get the person with Lewy body disease on their own with one other family member, then that really worked well for some people. This is an example of somebody sitting in the corner playing chess. Other examples were going out for a walk in the garden. So things like divide and conquer, I like to call it, but just creating yourself a bit of peace and quiet and not having to go and hide in another room, which was what people quite often reported. So in terms of family members, I've put these are from the same person, but I thought she made two quite interesting points. So she starts by saying, I personally feel like I'm cheated out of the last few years. And then she goes on to explain, actually, she's got a really good social life compared to lots of other people I talked to. So that was quite interesting. So they had a big crowd of friends who'd now actually made an effort to include her. So even though her husband would stay at home, she still had the opportunity to go out. But the second quote I thought was really interesting, because she says, it's a standing joke. Everyone says you're too damn stuck up to go and use a bus. And she said, it isn't that. I've lost my nerve. And it's because of her macular degeneration. But I think that's a really telling quote because of this sense that your world starts shrinking and you start going out less. And then actually you do lose your confidence. And then it is difficult to start going out again. So I thought that was a really interesting thing she said. And I wanted to finish, I think, with a very positive thing. And this was a couple who I interviewed who'd clearly had quite a tempestuous marriage. She said at the end of the interview, she said, yeah, we used to lead separate lives, didn't we? So in another way, it's good because it's drawn us together. It swings and roundabouts, isn't it? Which I thought was a nice place to end. So in terms of services, I think the process of interviewing these people, couples and individuals, has really highlighted the challenges that Lewy body dementia actually puts in your way every single day. And what was great was how resourceful people were in meeting these difficulties. But obviously not everybody was. And it would be great if we could share some of these resourceful ideas more widely with other people, I think. And I think the other thing is it's this thing in terms of managing Lewy body dementia. It's like, whose job is it to deal with these social difficulties? Whose job is it to say, how's your social life? You know, if you're a geriatrician or an old age psychiatrist, you'll already have your list of things you need to get through and look at. You know, so it is like, how does this get addressed for people? And it seems crucial because it's very easy for people to become isolated socially. It's difficult for them to maintain activities. And that's quite important because it's not just the activity, it's having a sense of yourself and who you are, the sorts of things you're interested in. But it's also just physically moving and going out and maintaining, you know, your physical strength. And it's also just about keeping a good quality of life. I just wanted to thank my co-investigators in the Diamond Lewy programme, and also all the people who took part in the interviews and the clinicians who helped us with recruitment. And this is just the acknowledgement of funding from the National Institute of Health Research. So thank you for listening.